And now, Turkey has been essentially pro-West. We depend on their bases. There are 16 mutual assistance pacts between the generals of Turkey and Israel. So at the moment, they're an ally. But if you've studied the background, and I didn't have time to include it here in the briefing in detail, obviously they are being forced to shift their focus from the West to the East and towards Islam once again. Now, the Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about this invasion of these allies, armed and led by Magog, is the occasion where God will intervene rather dramatically to wipe out the invading forces. And many scholars, Hal Lindsey being probably the lead among them, feel that this is part of the Armageddon scenario, and they may be right. There are a group of us, myself, Grant Jeffries, and some others, that believe this is a precedent event before Armageddon, in fact, before the 70th week of Daniel. And for some technical reasons I won't go into, but we watch this closely because it clearly is getting positioned on our horizon. Sheba and Dedan, which are references in Ezekiel that really refer to what we call Saudi Arabia, are not in the action, but on the sidelines, scolding everybody for what's going on. Very interesting passage. Now, where does this really occur? If you've done your prophecy homework, you know about the 70th week of Daniel is the primary timeline for the end times that Gabriel gave Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. 69 weeks were fulfilled to the exact day when Jesus presented himself as the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the King. There's an interval between the 69th and the 70th week, that's verse 26 of that series, in which the Messiah is cut off or executed, the city and the temple is destroyed. That interval has lasted about 2,000 years. There is a 7-year period that is the most documented period in the Bible, both Old and New Testament. We call it the 70th week of years of Daniel. It's defined by a covenant being enforced by this world leader, but in the middle of that 7-year period, he sets up what is called the abomination of desolation. He actually sets himself up to be worshipped. And the period from that event to the end of that 7-year period, a 3.5-year period, is what Jesus himself labels as the Great Tribulation, quoting from Daniel 12. Now, we know the temple will be standing in order for that to happen. We don't know when it'll be rebuilt. It might be rebuilt before this week starts. It might be rebuilt during the first half of this week of years. We don't know, but we do know it's standing then because it gets desecrated by this leader. Now, this 7-year period climaxes in this ultimately climactic battle called the Battle of Armageddon, which, of course, is followed by the second coming in power by the Lord himself, and it also starts a period that we call the millennium. Now, where does the Magog invasion occur? The Magog invasion, according to many scholars, including Hal Lindsey and so forth, occurs as sort of part of this Armageddon scenario. There are a group of us, though, that believe it occurs at or prior to the beginning of the 7-year period. For some technical reasons that aren't important, you need to remember my trademark, which is Acts 17:11, where Luke tells you that the Bereans were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all openness of mind, yet search the scriptures daily to prove whether those things be so. Now, that's where Luke tells you, don't believe anything Chuck Missler tells you, but search it out for yourself. All I want to do is stir you up to look in the right places, to put it together on your own. Well, let's focus on Israel. We'll talk a little bit more detail about Israel. Its flag was officially adopted, of course, in 1948. It was first introduced back in 1891 by the Zionist movement. And the six-pointed star that was so familiar is actually dates from about the 14th century. Trying to date it earlier is very difficult, because that's complicated. If you study the book of Judges, you remember Joshua was instructed when they entered the land to wipe out certain adversarial groups. And the succeeding generation failed to follow up on that instruction, which is detailed in Deuteronomy 7 and elsewhere. The strongholds that Israel failed to wipe out constitute the problems that make up the book of Judges. And of course, Jericho is the capital of these guys, which means Bet Yarah. It's the house of the moon god. Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, the Golan, Gaza. What's provocative when you study the book of Judges is to look at the book of Judges as a book of prophecy. Because if you look at Israel today, the territories that are disputed are the very territories that gave them the trouble back then that they failed to deal with adequately. The Golan, Jenin, Nablus, Ramallah, Jericho. Jericho is the capital of PLO. And Gaza, the Gaza Strip, of course. How fascinating that the same spirits animating those adversaries then are still at it. Let's move on. When did Israel really begin? Well, in one sense, you could argue that it began with the seed of the woman prophecy in Genesis 3:15, when it was first announced, that when God declared war on Satan. And a summary of this concept of the woman, of course, occurs in Revelation chapter 12. In another sense, you can say Israel started with the call of Abraham, Genesis 12, and then amplified in 15 and 17. But the Scripture tends to reckon the birth of the nation Israel at the Exodus, as it is so declared in Exodus chapter 4. Now let's remember, because this is a controversial part of view on our horizon, in Genesis 15, God indulges in a ritual that was classic in those days, to cut a covenant. Barat means to cut a covenant. The participants in this kind of a covenant would divide a sacrifice and then together walk in a figure eight between the parts of that sacrifice, repeating the terms of the covenant. And God has Abram set that up, but then he puts Abraham in a deep sleep, and God goes through this procedure alone in the form of a flaming torch and so on. What is the point God is making? That the covenant that he's making with Abraham is unconditional. God alone is the participant here. And this view is confirmed, is declared eternal and unconditional. It's reconfirmed by an oath in Genesis 22. It is confirmed to Isaac and to Jacob in Genesis 26, the descendants of Abraham, and it's confirmed under conditions of disobedience. The Bible makes it clear that there's nothing they can do to disinherit themselves, because that was an unconditional commitment on the part of the God of the universe. And to attack that is to attack the character of God. The New Testament declares it immutable in Hebrews 6. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Because this issue is the thing that is being attacked by the world today, Israel's right to the land. They're the only nation on the planet Earth where the creator of the planet Earth has given them a land grant under certain conditions, but we'll talk about that later. Well, the birth then of the nations is roughly 1,500 years ago. And of course, they conquered the land under Joshua. Saul was their first king. Most of you know this history, how it gets divided. And then the northern kingdom goes from bad to worse and gets defeated by Assyria, the northern tribes, exiled. And Pharaoh Necho is finally defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is God's instrument for the southern kingdom. And there's 3 sieges of the southern kingdom. Those are very important to understand if you're going to be in prophecy. I won't take the time to get in the details here. Persian Empire conquers Babylon. Cyrus orders the return, allows them to rebuild their temple. Nehemiah finally gains the authority to really build the city, to defend themselves, to build the temple. And you know the story, I believe. Alexander finally conquers the Persians, which begins the Hellenistic view of Judea. And then we have this interesting passage in Daniel 11, which lists all these leaders. I'll come to that in a little more detail later. Antiochus Epiphanes is one of these leaders that is very anti-Semitic. He makes reading the Torah a capital crime. He sets the abomination of desolation in the temple that Jesus makes reference to 3 centuries later as something that's going to happen again at the end time. So it's very important to understand this period. The antics of Antiochus Epiphanes caused the Maccabean revolt. They finally they throw off the yoke of the Greek Empire, or the Seleucid Empire, and the temple is rededicated, and that is celebrated to this day by what the Jews call Hanukkah. And it's also authenticated in the New Testament in John chapter 10. And then that leads finally to the Hasmonean and the Roman period. And in the Roman period, by the way, let's understand that while the Roman army conquers Judea in 63 BC, the rival empire to the east, the Parthians, conquered from the Romans for a few years, and that gives rise to attention. Judea is a buffer state, and unless you understand that, you won't understand what the Magi were all about at Christmas. But Herod finally regains Jerusalem and expands the temple and so forth. That brings us to the birth of Christ, somewhere between 2 and 4 BC, depending on what expert you lean on. And Pontius Pilate is the prosecutor, and then of course we get to the ministry of Jesus. When Jesus is in that final week, he declares national blindness on the nation Israel in Luke 19. Forever no. Paul tells you in Romans 11:25 how long that blindness will endure, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. The destruction of Jerusalem is predicted in Daniel 9:26, and Jesus amplifies that very week. And anyway, we ultimately get to the fall of Jerusalem by the Romans, and the last stand of the Jews at Masada. The Council of Yabne is where they redefine Judaism. You need to understand that Judaism today is, they mean Talmudic Judaism.